Recursive orbital collapse, the prolonged trauma at the heart of the survivor. This is not a breakdown, this is a recursive orbital collapse. It doesn't happen all at once, but rather in spirals, tightening loops of disassociation, grief, hypervigilance, agitation, and silence. Survivors describe this as madness, the end of everything, or losing their mind. But what they really are experiencing is the destruction of the structural architecture that had unconsciously stabilized their inner world, the shared fantasy, the borrowed self, the borrowed mother. So, what collapses and why? Well, a survivor doesn't collapse because they were weak or overinvested. They collapse because their entire symbolic scaffolding was made out of someone else's fantasy. A false self, animated in them through the mirroring gaze of the narcissist, had taken over as their functional identity. It worked until it didn't. When the narcissist withdraws or discards, the borrowed structure folds in on itself, and the survivor is left with fragments. A co opted libidinal part, the longing child still addicted to attachment, an inverted anti libidinal part, the projected mother who now punishes or shames, a mute internal child, frozen in unmet needs, a truth self, often only a whisper, a pseudo false self, protective, performative, and collapsed, and dozens of introjected voices, not just from the narcissist, but from caregivers, society, and the self during the fantasy. These fragments orbit the missing center. That center is the central ego, the coherent self, now hidden behind pain, repetition, and dysregulation. So, what is recursive orbital collapse? MPIT defines it as a multi phased symbolic implosion of the survivor's internal architecture following the withdrawal of the fantasy scaffold. The collapse is recursive, it loops, fragments, and reinstalls itself as both a behavioral pattern and an affective condition. The survivor becomes trapped in a symbolic orbit around their lost central ego, unable to re-stabilize due to co-opted libidinal structures and introjected narratives. It's recursive, so the collapse reactivates itself constantly. A smell, a tone, a memory, a thought, a sound can restart the loop. It's not linear. Orbital, there is no ground. The survivor is held in place not by gravity, but by symbolic centripetal force, shame, trauma bonding, hope, fear of abandonment, and the collapse, the fantasy scaffold is gone. What remains are the floating parts of the self, but with no integrated architecture. The recursive collapse is the trauma, is what survivors are trying to survive. Not the breakup, not the abuse, but the annihilation of the internal psychic coherence they never knew was borrowed. The loop itself, each survivor's loop is slightly different, but the M-pit recursive collapse sequence often includes a triggering event, the discard, a betrayal, withdrawal, rupture, affective rupture, the moment of cold empathy withdrawal. This activates inversed mirrored reflexive apathy, the death drive, thanatos, the interject hijacked. This is the narcissist's voice taking over the internal monologue, and the survivor blames the self. The libidinal grasp, longing returns. This is the redeemer ego trying to fix it. Anti libidinal punishment, false mother attacks, and the survivor shames the self. Silent collapses, disassociation, emotional death, immobility, agitation bursts, sudden activity, things like showering, cleaning, etc. And then finding yourself doing things like vomiting, high levels of nausea, unable to sit still, filled full of tremors. Loop reset, back to longing or interjects, and the loop restarts. This can last minutes, hours, or days. For many survivors, it repeats for months or years. Why is it so hard to escape. The center is hidden. The central ego is still there, but invisible behind inherited pain. Each part thinks it is the truth. The shame voice, the redeemer voice, the trauma child, all believe they are the real you. Reality testing is broken. Inverse mirror reflexive apathy, cold empathy, and trauma co option damage survivors' capacity to distinguish fantasy from memory. The only structure they had was the shared fantasy. So when it ends, the world is formless. Plus, no one sees them. The pain is so internalized and recursive that others misread the survivor as obsessive, unstable, or even narcissistic. So, what are the symbolic and clinical implications for MPIT? The recursive orbital collapse is the diagnostic center of post narcissistic trauma. It is not a CPTSD symptom, it is the structural injury that creates CPTSD. It explains why survivors develop pseudo narcissistic traits under collapse. It defines why libidinal regulation fails. The drive towards attachment is now circular. It is why stabilization, not confrontation, is the first stage of recovery, and it maps precisely onto the end-pit orbital collapse diagram. Each loop is an orbit around the lost center. Peace out. Loads of love.